creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage.
America Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We're going to focus some time and attention for a few minutes on Africa. And if you've listened to any of the programs we've done in the last couple of months, you know, we've had Kathy Dudley on here, Amani Bridges talking about the need for leadership in Nigeria, for example. This weekend I was with somebody who's been a missionary most of her life in Kenya. Talked about leadership there. Some of my staff, for example, have been to places like Liberia and Uganda and a variety of other places around Africa. And it is exciting to see how the body of Christ is expanding. But there is such a need for training pastors, providing leadership, and that's why I'm just so thrilled that we can bring to the microphone individual that serves as the executive director of Leadership Vistas. Was called to that ministry back in 2016. Before that, served with a ministry I think very highly of, Marketplace Chaplains. And we'll talk more about that. But also as an individual, graduated from West Point, has served in the military for a while. So thank you for your service, as well as has a MA degree from Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia, a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and soon to be Dr. Andy Bunn, who is getting his PhD in leadership from Piedmont International University. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It is so good to have you here. And let's, if we can, maybe talk about how you ended up there, because obviously this is an organization that we want to feature. You can go to leadershipvistas.org. We have a link there. One of the things I always encourage you to do is watch the video. Now, it's about a 5-minute video, but there you can watch it, learn a great deal about Leadership Vistas, and then up on the right-hand corner is a share button. So would you take the time to watch it, click that button, then put it on your Facebook page, Twitter. Maybe you know a pastor, I'm sure you do, or a missions pastor, or somebody else that needs to know about this conversation, and so send that to them by email. But for those people that haven't watched the video yet, although that's the assignment for everybody listening right now, give us a little bit of a background on Leadership Vistas.
Well, Leadership Vistas, we equip African church leaders to fulfill God's will. We train church leaders.
Sure.
And it was begun several years ago by Jerry Brown, the founder, and his wife, Jolynn. And they took a trip, or Jerry did, in the 90s, and the Lord just took hold of his heart, and he wanted to formalize it even more, and in the early 2000s was led to establish and found Leadership Vistas International Ministries. And for many years, many trips, short-term mission trips to train church leaders, he led them well. And in the last few years, decided to allow the Lord to find someone to take up the helm and continue. And I happen to be the gentleman that has the privilege to take that step now. And it was very clear a few years ago, after many years with Marketplace Chaplains, which I truly enjoyed and learned so much from and grew just greatly. But it was clear the Lord was calling me to this ministry. And so on November 1st of 2016, I heeded that call, and it's just been an outstanding journey of trusting the Lord, following his leadership, and seeing his great work, both here in the U.S., but so much so in Africa.
When people go to the website, and again, it's leadershipvistas.org, and you can, of course, watch the interview right now on either our feed that's on pointofview.net, or also we're on Facebook Live, so you can watch it either place. Matter of fact, at Facebook Live, if you want to leave some comments, we'll read those a little bit later. There's a section there on where we serve. So talk about the geographical location where a lot of this service is taking place right now.
Primarily in Eastern Central Africa, Our hub for the last several years, and since I've had the privilege to lead it, has been in Uganda, Kibale and Kasese primarily.
Yes.
We've been there several times, and what we have done is we go in for a 4-day conference of training both men and women church leaders. And through the hub of Kibale and Kasese, we have had leaders from all over Eastern and Central Africa join us. And for instance, Kenya, Burundi, the Congo, different places, and usually a couple hundred to a little more each time that we're able to train with at least 3 courses for men and women by highly trained and called instructors that choose to go on short-term mission trips with us.
Well, again, you're getting your PhD in leadership, so you certainly bring that to the table. But, of course, all of your experience at Marketplace Chaplains and other things are helpful. And talk about that for just a minute, because a lot of us here, we take for granted so much. Matter of fact, lately I've been talking about some of the books they've translated into Spanish, for example, economics and Islam, things like that. And I find that we have this abundance of blessing. Matter of fact, next hour we'll have Jerry Tooman talking about how to think about finances from a biblical point of view. You go to other countries, those kinds of things that we take for granted here don't exist. And leadership is one of those. I mean, most people in America have been around leaders. They've heard leadership talks. Maybe they even have Bibles or books that they've read over the years on leadership. But you go to Africa, there is a crying and significant need, isn't there?
Absolutely. And not only in general for leadership, but particularly what we've been called to do in training church leaders, pastors, because what traditionally happens is wonderful organizations, evangelical ministries go in, evangelize, share the gospel, and many come to know Christ, and that's just a great thing.
Yes.
And due to the tribal climate and different things in the smaller towns and even larger cities, the most prominent man usually is given a Bible and said, "Here."
You're the teacher.
And
you're the pastor. You're the spiritual leader.
Exactly.
Right. I've seen that.
And they're really not equipped
That's true.
To take that on. And so what the Lord has called us to do at Leadership Vistas is come alongside them, give them some baseline theology, some pastoral care, some pastoral leadership training. And it is amazing what God has done through that. And watching each individual leader get trained, they sit there and they are totally engaged.
I was going to say, they will travel for hours just to come and hear what we would maybe say, I'll get to it next time.
It doesn't matter if it's 9 o'clock in the morning or if it's 1:30 right after lunch. They are completely engaged.
Of course.
And I remember talking to one pastor who shared with me, and it hit me so hard. The stories you hear about what they go through every day with persecution, whether it be physical from the rebels that may come and just shoot up a church or a home at any time, or whether it's just the climate and the different things that happen. And one particular pastor came to me once, and they were having what they call a famine, not a drought. They call it famine. And men particularly were just dying in their town. And he wanted me to pray with him, so I did. And his story was that people were coming to his church, and even at his church, he didn't have anything physical, no money, nothing to give them. All he could give them was Jesus.
Yeah.
And he said it just like he just smiled as soon as he said it, but you could tell his heart ached and my heart ached, because that's what they go through.
Yeah.
And so what we do in sharing, training, teaching, also helps them, I think, in being able to deal with all types of situations that they otherwise wouldn't be prepared for. But I can tell you, all of them, almost to the person, will tell you that everything, as far as they're concerned, is about Jesus.
We're going to take a break and talk a little bit more about how you can get involved with Leadership Vistas, but we need to take a break. Andy Bunn with us. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The democratically controlled House of Representatives just passed a signature piece of legislation. The bill clearly illustrates what the congressional leaders would like to do in America if they could control both the houses of Congress and the presidency. The editors of National Review call it a legislative buffet of bad ideas. The Institute for Free Speech calls it the For the Politicians Act. And the American Civil Liberties Union wrote a letter to the members of Congress urging them to vote no on the bill. When you have such diverse groups expressing their concern about the bill, you know it has many problems. For example, the bill would expand the requirements for financial disclosure. First, this is of concern as a time when citizens are being harassed and intimidated because they supported a marriage amendment on the ballot. Second, even the ACLU has expressed concern that a person could be exposed as a political donor if an organization chooses, without the donor's knowledge, to mention a politician by name. The bill would also revamp the Federal Elections Commission and virtually assure that it would come under partisan control. The bill strips from the states the ability to draw their own congressional districts, which are much more likely to understand the cultures and different priorities of the regions in their state. Critics also see much of the bill as designed to limit political speech. We have seen the desire of social media outlets and universities to control any speech that is unpopular or contradictory to political correctness. The bill attempts to micromanage speech into government-approved lanes. It is unlikely that a Republican-controlled Senate will approve this legislation, but the bill does show what Democrat leaders would want to implement if Democrats win control of Congress and the White House. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Eddie Bunn with us today, and he is the Executive Director of Leadership Vistas International. If you go to leadershipvistas.org, you can find some great information. And let's, if we can, see if we can get you some volunteers, maybe even staff members, who knows. But we've talked about where you serve. And so when you go to the website, that's the first button on the left, and that will give you a little bit of a geographical orientation. People fail to realize how large Africa is. And so to one of my African missionary friends the other day, I found a picture where they had the map of Africa, and in it they put most of Europe, all of the United States, and a variety of other countries, just to show you this is huge. And of course, the need is very great, as you would point out. But let's talk about the second button there, which is Take Action, because there are mission trips. There are opportunities to volunteer, and most importantly, of course, you want people to pray for you. So let's take each one of those individually. What about mission trips? I know right now there's some churches, maybe even Sunday school classes, saying, I'd like to do a mission trip, maybe a short-term one, and they may not even know there is such a group called Leadership Vistas. But if they would like to partner with you and join with you, what does that entail?
Well, we try to do 2 short-term mission trips a year with the 4-day conferences in 2 locations. So over 2 weeks, about 17 days.
Yes.
And we take a team of anywhere from 12 to 18, and they have administrative tasks to some degree. A lot are instructors for what we teach.
Right.
And so anyone who might have some qualifications to actually teach both men and women different aspects of what our curriculum would be, that would be most helpful with joining in with us. And then along with that, anyone who would just appreciate the experience of learning more about what mission work is about and how engaging the African church leaders in particular are, and how just hungry they are for the Word of God, and then for sharing it and making the continent of Africa that much smaller in that way, because not only do they want to take it to their churches and use what they're taught, but they really have a calling to do even more. And it's very evident with all the ones that we have the privilege to train. So anyone who would be interested, we welcome them going to our website and contacting us through that and letting us know. And our next major one will be in the fall, the end of September through mid-October.
Yes. And again, when you talk about credentials, I recognize that I have a friend that teaches leadership at the Cox School of Business at SMU. Well, obviously, they're very qualified. But, I would have to say that some people that maybe have just read a couple of John Maxwell books on leadership might be way ahead of the individuals that we're going to be taught in Africa. So, and again, like you said, you don't necessarily have to be a teacher. There's administrative opportunities. There's just all sorts of things. And it really is just a great vision trip as well, if somebody can take the time to go out there and spend some time in Africa.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. We welcome all.
So that's the missions trip. Now, volunteers, I know that you have a need even in the office as well, and event coordination, all sorts of other things. So what would be available there?
Well, we have one major event a year right now, planning to have a second one later in the year.
Okay.
Our fundraising dinner is coming up in April.
Okay.
Standing firm as leaders for his kingdom is the thing. And so anyone who would like to be a part of that and volunteer to help us, we would welcome it, because we still need about 10 to 12 to help us actually carry that out.
Yes.
And then throughout the year, just in doing our traditional office kind of activities and preparation, anyone who'd like to help us out with that, we would welcome them coming. And so we could share with them, they could share with us, and we could grow together in what the Lord is allowing to happen through Leadership Vistas.
Let's give them the date in April, because somebody might even want to buy a table or something like that. So
okay. Absolutely. It's April 30th, and it's at the Hope Center, which is
very simple.
Us, along with 40-plus other evangelical nonprofit ministries, benefit greatly from June Hunt, who built that building for that purpose, and it's just been an excellent experience for us.
Well, it has been for us as well. I start my day at Probe on the second floor, come on over here, and then head back there a little bit later. And we've had Sue Bailey here going through the various ministries out there, so that's certainly one of the things that we would encourage. April 30th at the Hope Center, and you can find out more at Leadership Vistas. And then prayer, I don't want to make that last, but it's the third one on the sheet there. But it's a really important one, because you are, as you just already pointed out, dealing with people with incredible needs who are coming asking for prayer, having faced levels of persecution that most of us in North America can't even imagine.
And that would be my first and foremost prayer request. Having witnessed it firsthand with my first visit in November of 2016, they literally have challenges that we can't fathom, and I couldn't have before that time. Honestly, I've read about it. I could have experienced it through that, but you really don't. And by going and seeing it, they literally face things that we do actually take for granted here. And so, praying for them to be strong, to stand firm, as they are examples to us of that every day, and to be able to continue to do so. I would appreciate everyone praying for those church leaders who do that in Africa. Yes.
Now, somebody would want to know a little bit more. Since you're located in the Hope Center, it seems to me that if somebody wanted to just come and look around, see what's available, or find out more about this dinner that's coming April 30th. Is that a possibility? Of course, you have a way in which people can connect up with you, but talk about how people can get closer to you and learn a little bit more about what you're doing.
Oh, yes. I would welcome the opportunity to meet with anyone who would want to. I'm always available, but also you can just drop by the Hope Center. And we are an open door to anyone who'd want to learn more. And I always enjoy talking about what God is doing, not only with Leadership Vistas, but we're in a smaller area of the Hope Center called the Ruth Center,
right?
That actually has some smaller ministries like ours, but there's a synergy and a togetherness and just a total it's not a dependence, but it's just different in that regard. And I would love to share with anyone what all of those are doing, as well as the larger ones are throughout the Hope Center as well, because it is very obvious that God is doing a great thing through the Hope Center and through the ministries that are privileged to be there.
One last comment. We have a section there on where we serve, take action, contact us, but also donate. What are some of the financial needs so that people that might want to make this part of their mission budget or give you to you individually? Talk about that if they might.
Well, one thing I've had to learn over the last couple of years is that there is a need for constant fundraising, and it is very evident the Lord wants us doing His mission in Africa, and the reality is for us to accomplish that, we really need folks to give, and that has been a great blessing for me, just to see the hearts open of people who just want to give. And so there's so many ways. One is just traditional way they can go to the website and donate through that with a one-time gift. We really pray for recurring givers, or what we refer to as Vista Legacy Partners, folks who will come alongside us on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual basis and give and just partner with us in that way. But then we have specific things as well. We have what we started just last year, and Jolynn Brown, who still works with me in the ministry, took this and ran with it, and it's just been great. We call it the PSI, Pastoral Scholarship Initiative.
Perfect. And
someone can sponsor a church leader for $200. And
that's great.
And what we do is send them a picture of that person along with a few details, but not too much, and then the prayer request of that particular church leader, such that that supporter can have that in their home and pray for that person regularly. So,
just before I let you go, let me just talk about the fact that you would be available to come and speak at a missions conference at a church or something like that.
I would love to.
And I think that's another thing, because
anytime.
I would imagine there are a lot of people that say, this is the first time I've ever heard about Leadership Vistas, and maybe our congregation needs to know a little bit more. And I think you could really make the case. I know that sometimes when I've had individuals here from Africa, their English isn't as good, and so your English is very good, and you could make the case for so many, show some pictures, some slides, and
Absolutely.
really recruit some people to be a part of that as well. So there's a place where you can take action. That's the middle button there. But again, one more time, it's a 5-minute video. Take the time to watch the video, click that share button, and educate some others. If you know a pastor or a missions pastor that doesn't know about Leadership Vistas, take what you just heard and pass it on to them as well. So, Andy, thanks for coming by. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let's just take a break, and when we come back, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about a piece that came out by Peggy Noonan. She was, of course, one of the speechwriters for Ronald Reagan. The Two Americas Have Grown Much Fiercer. It relates to many of the commentaries I've written, and even one coming out. And don't forget that at the top of the hour, we'll be doing our weekend edition, and that'll be Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you a program note, though. In about a half an hour, we're going to get into a lot of the issues related to health care, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, this lawsuit brought by the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, and other attorney generals, primarily from red states, really challenges the whole issue of the Affordable Care Act, and arguing, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, that indeed if you got rid of the individual mandate, the requirement that somebody has to buy something, then since that is essential to Obamacare, essentially the entire bill is now unconstitutional. We'll see where that goes, but up until now, that's been something on the periphery until the Justice Department the other day said, no, we think this is a good idea. President Obama certainly seems to, but then there are people in the Justice Department, like William Barr and others, that disagree. So we're going to get into that, what that might mean. We're going to kind of give you some counterpoint, because oftentimes even people that identify themselves as conservatives say, just basically repealing Obamacare without replacing it, we got a problem. And so we want to get into some of that in large part because Dr. Merrill Matthews is certainly an expert in the health care issue. Also, we've posted a piece on what Medicare for All supporters won't tell you. Very good. So we'll get into that for a while. Before we get into some other issues, we'll look at the campaign. I've posted something by Joe Biden, or actually about Joe Biden and his candidacy, and many people wonder whether or not it's going to go forward. That's, of course, a big issue. And we, of course, have been following the Chick-fil-A story. Every day there's something else, because first it's the announcement from the San Antonio City Council, then it's the response from Chick-fil-A. Then the other day we were talking about the response from First Liberty, which we'll get into. And now even perhaps Ken Paxton, who I just mentioned, is involved. And there's some very legitimate questions that people are asking, so we'll see if we can try to answer some of those in the third hour, probably, when we'll get to some of those. So that's just an overview of the next couple of hours, but before we go any further, wanted to read this piece by Peggy Noonan. You might say, who's she? Well, she actually was the primary speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. Some of those eloquent speeches by Ronald Reagan were written by her. And so she has always been a great commentator of various issues. She was in Dallas about a year and a half ago, and I had a chance to meet her and introduce her to the Council for Life group. And so her piece is entitled, The Two Americas Have Grown Much Fiercer. The subtitle is, The United States was divided 46 years ago, but no one saw it as a fight to the death. Now, if you do your math, 46 puts you back in 1973, or when Richard Nixon won re-election after defeating Walter Mondale. And it's kind of, not Walter Mondale, George McGovern. I'm jumping ahead because I will get to Walter Mondale a little bit later. George McGovern back in 1972. And if nothing else, she really talks about this. Now, she could have said back to maybe 51 years ago, that puts you in 1968 with all the assassinations and all the turmoil, anti-Vietnam War and the rest. But this, I think, just illustrates the point that in some respects, we've had division before, but this division is a little different. And so let me just, if I can, read parts of what she has to say and then point to some of my commentaries, either that I've already written and you've heard, or one coming out next week. Because she says, sometimes you write about the most obvious thing in the world because it is the most important thing. Reaction to the outcome of Robert Mueller's investigation shows Americans, again, how divided we are. If you're more or less of the left, you experienced a probe as a search for truth that would restore the previous world of politics. Instead, the traitor got away with it, and you feel destabilized, deflated. And if you're a Trumpian right, it was from the beginning an attempted coup, the establishment using everything it had to force or to remove a force it could not defeat at the polls. You are energized and elated. Now both sides will settle down, with the left as forthcoming in its defeat as the right in forbearing in its victory. I just wanted to show you my fantasy life. The Trump forces will, of course, strike with great pent-up anger, and the left will never let go. The point she makes is both sides will be intensely human and inhuman. Because the past few years, the character of our political divisions have changed, and this must be noted again, people are proud of their bitterness now. Old America used to accept our splits as part of the price of being us. Numerous, varied, ornery. Current America, with its moderating institutions, churches going down, and its dividing institutions, the internet, rising, sees our polarization not as something to be healed, but a reason for being something to get up for, and there's a finality to it, a war to the death quality. Again, she may have overstated it a little bit, but it illustrates, again, some of the division we'll talk about in just a minute. It is actually shocking. And she says, I say this as a person who's always generally unshocked by American political division because I came of age at it. When I was a kid, we came together as a nation when John F. Kennedy died and manned rockets went up, and after it was pretty much turmoil. Vietnam, demonstrations, Watergate. You're on one side or the other. The terms left and right started replacing the boring old Democrat and Republican. She says, I'll never forget seeing on the cover of Time magazine in October of 1972 an essay by Lance Morrow that was ostensibly about the last days of the race between Richard Nixon and George McGovern, but really was about something bigger. She says, I was in college and it struck me. It was called The Two Americas and was elegantly written and prescient. That is, if prophetic could be another way to say that. The candidates were so unlike each other that they seemed to represent two different instincts about America. They suggested almost two different countries, two different cultures, two different Americas. Mr. Morrow wrote, the McGovern campaign marches to the rhythms of the long Wagnerian 60s, racial upheaval, the war, feminism, sexual revolution. McGovernites had a more romantic conception of what leadership could or should be. In Nixon's America, on the other hand, there was a sense of system, the free enterprise system, the law and order system, even the family unit system. They were protective of it, grateful to it, and the antonym to their idea of system wasn't utopia, it was chaos. They are, again, quoting from this particular essay, apprehensive of the disorders that the late 60s brought to them, the turmoils that they suspect a McGovern ascension might bring. They wanted evolution, not revolution. And so, again, she goes through how there were both kind of divided America, and very divided indeed in 1972 between George McGovern representing kind of an anti-war Vietnam hippie movement, and then, of course, Richard Nixon representing more of an establishment movement, a Republican, law and order. We can't allow this to take place. But it's interesting that even in this essay, going back to the essay again, written by Lance Morrow, he concluded with the observation that within the two Americas, he saw one common denominator: the sophistication of the people, their earnest desire left, right, and center to find and support the best thing for America. And it was written, she says, with respect and warmth towards the American people that's not so common now. So she goes on to say that in my lifetime, I've seen two things that have helped reorder ourselves as a nation into something rough, if at least temporary unity. The first, she says, is tragedy, such as 9/11, which brought the nation together. The other example, she says, was just the sheer popularity of individuals, and that would be certainly Ronald Reagan, because he had two authentic landslides. The second one in 1984, where he ran against Walter Mondale, who I mentioned just a minute ago, basically winning 49 states. But she concludes that today's America doesn't yield outcomes like this. There are something we did then that could never happen now. And so the point she's making is there was something that always sort of brought us together, even when there were very significant divisions. One of the examples she uses, since I have just a minute before we go to the break, is when she worked with Ronald Reagan, there were times when you would provide praise for the other side. She talks about, for example, there was a Rose Garden speech praising the excellence of Scoop Jackson, who was a Democrat. John F. Kennedy, of course, a Democratic president. A speech never given that was supposed to be given on the excellence of Eleanor Roosevelt, also a Democrat. He said, we quoted, meaning Ronald Reagan and the writing she did, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, more actually than we quoted Dwight Eisenhower. The boss had been a Democrat. He'd stumped for Truman in 48 with Truman, but Reagan was not sentimental about our divisions. He knew exactly why he was not a Democrat anymore, but he took every chance to reach across the lines and hold on. And the point she's making is that, yes, we were divided 46 years ago in 1973. I lived through that. Some of you younger listeners are saying, I wasn't around. But, those of you that are a little bit older might say, yeah, I remember 1968. I remember 1973, where the divisions were so incredible because of Vietnam, because of Watergate, because of race relations, because of the rise of feminism, the counterculture, and all the rest. But there was still something that kind of pulled us together. And, of course, as she points out, we don't find that anymore. So when we come back from our break, I wanted to just briefly cite some of the commentaries that I've written on this, because what we have as an anecdotal story is validated by some pretty good research. We'll be right back.
Have you heard about the Drag Queen Story Hours taking place at various public libraries across the country? These events started popping up a couple of years ago. They feature flamboyant drag queens reading stories to children, mostly in libraries, sometimes in schools or bookstores. One Detroit drag queen who read to kids at Huntington Woods Library marvels that the little girls thought she was a princess. The Washington Post reports that Drag Queen Story Hour aims to teach children gender diversity and acceptance. It was created in 2015 by a San Francisco writer, a new mother who wanted to provide young children with both a charismatic performance and cultural lesson. The events are popular at certain libraries. One parent says she's pleased that Drag Queen Story Hours expose kids to all kinds of different, beautiful people in the world. The Post quotes another satisfied parent who says, "This is very different ideology from what the president is putting out there." The Drag Queen Story Hour, and yes, there is an actual organization, DQSH, has the full support of the American Library Association, which says the events create, quote, a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. The events have also drawn significant controversy, with parents complaining and protesters showing up outside libraries. Houston residents have filed a lawsuit to stop these taxpayer-funded drag events at Montrose Library. One popular drag queen reader there, Tatiana Malanina, translated Tatiana Bad Girl, is Alberto Garza. He was convicted in 2008 of assaulting an 8-year-old boy. Library officials admit, we discovered we failed to complete a background check as required by our own guidelines. Cultural commentator Rod Dreher blogged last year about drag being politicized and valorized as a force for political progress, adding that drag queens and their supporters are grooming these kids to accept gender fluidity as normal. Forget Tatiana Bad Girl. Parents and officials who support this story hour agenda are abusing children. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just again mention that in just a few minutes we will have Dr. Merrill Matthews and Penna Dexter here, be talking about all sorts of issues, not the least of which is this the end of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, because of some of the lawsuits brought by the Attorney General Ken Paxton and other attorney generals. What does that mean? Of course, we also have a piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews, What Medicare for All Supporters Won't Tell You. And then we'll get into some other topics in the news. There are many, but let me finish off this real quickly. I just read a little bit of the piece by Peggy Noonan, The Two Americas Have Grown Much Fiercer. And it's interesting, she takes it back to 1940 well, basically 1973 by 46 years. And I think she does that in large part because she's talking about this essay that was in Time magazine in 1972. But we were even talking at the break how you could go back 51 years to 1968, the summer of conflict, Vietnam War, Chicago, and all the rest. And so the bottom line is, I don't want to sound like one of those old guys saying, oh, it was so nice in the past. No, there were some major divisions in America in the past. And I think it's kind of interesting to see that there was an essay that she quotes called The Two Americas. But the point she's making is the two Americas have grown much fiercer. And she gives us some anecdotes. But let me, if I can, for just a minute before we take our next break, point out that that is validated by a variety of different studies. One of those, which is cited interestingly enough, by Arthur Brooks, because he has a new book coming out, but in an op-ed goes back to an article that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which that particular article referred to what is called motive attribution asymmetry, which is a real long technical term for basically saying, I'm a good guy, you're a bad guy. We have an ideology based in love. Your opponents has an ideology based in hate. And so, interestingly enough, Arthur Brooks points out that if you look at the studies that they've done, they've said that the average Republican and the average Democrat today are as divided as the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so this is one of the real concerns that he talks about. And then goes on, because this is part of his op-ed that appeared in the New York Times and also part of his new book, which hopefully we'll have a chance to talk with him about in the future, is that he says people often say that our problem in America is incivility or intolerance. He said that is incorrect. Motive attribution asymmetry leads to something far worse, contempt, which he calls a noxious brew of anger and disgust. And it's made worse by what he calls the outrage industrial complex. Those are those individuals on the internet, even on talk radio, even on cable news and all the rest that cater to one side and criticize the other. And so what he says is that sometimes when we hear about this conflict, people will prescribe the wrong solutions. When we disagree, it doesn't mean we should put aside our disagreements, he said. It's not that we should disagree less. Instead, we should disagree better. Because when we're talking about issues like politics, economics, philosophy, we really need to engage in a robust competition of ideas. And so he talks about the idea that we need to really turn away from some of the rhetorical dope peddlers, he calls them, which are powerful people on your side profiting from this culture of contempt. And if nothing else, we should make a commitment not to treat others with contempt. And if you think about this, as Christians, we should be civil and gracious. So that's one of the things that appeared in the New York Times. More recently, and this column is coming out next week, is really interesting. I quote from Thomas Edsall, writing in the New York Times, in which he's also talking about some of these studies that have been done, and he calls this the idea of partisan hate. One of the academic papers he quotes from is called Lethal Mass Partisanship. And he found, for example, that about 42% of the people in each party view the opposition as downright evil. So Thomas Edsall puts it this way, that he therefore concludes that if you look at the last election, that means about 48 million voters who cast ballots in 2016 believe that members of the opposition party are in league with the devil. And he also cites something else which is interesting, because in that study, one of the questions they ask is, what if the opposing party wins the 2020 election? How much do you feel violence would be justified? And the study found that 18% of Democrats, 13% of Republicans said violence would be justified on a scale ranging from a little to a lot. So again, some of the things we've talked about in 1968 or 1973 certainly could be on the horizon. And then later in the commentary, Thomas Edsall quotes from another academic study that concludes that on both sides of the aisle, we've got something very different, and that is the best informed voters are the ones that are by far the most partisan. And he says, we would expect that well-educated, well-informed people might be able to pull what he calls the electorate out of the morass. And this is where David French, in one of his pieces more recently, quotes that and goes on to say that in a time of crisis, American citizens often look for guidance and take their cues from the subset of American citizens who are most engaged and informed. Yet he points out in study after study, it's now showing that this cohort of Americans is actually the one driving the engine of American division. So it seems to me that we're going to have to spend a little bit more time recognizing that some of those people that are the leaders of those particular movements are the ones that are actually stirring the pot and making it worse. Well, finally, I just thought I would end with a piece that I had come out just 2 weeks ago, and it comes from the interview that Nick Pitts and I did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, because one of the things I noticed is there was a quote going back to his earlier book called The Righteous Mind, and there he actually had a whole chapter in his book called The Conservative Advantage. Now, interesting enough, we've interviewed Jonathan Haidt on this program, and he calls himself a liberal and certainly believed that Hillary Clinton should have been president, and back then certainly believed that Barack Obama was a good president. So you have to understand that, because what he found is that he was convinced in his book that his fellow liberals do not get the morals and motives of the conservative countrymen, as he put it. Because one of the studies, which is in the book, and more recently when I was talking about that with Chelsea, she actually wanted me to photocopy those pages of the book, which I did. But it was a study that they did a number of years ago with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick and a couple of others, in which they had people fill out what they have their moral foundations questionnaire. That's in his book called The Righteous Mind. And so 1/3 of the time, individuals were supposed to fill out the questions as they would answer it themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And then 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. Now, the reason they did that is, first of all, it allowed them to examine some of the stereotypes that each side had about the other, but it also helped them see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and who were conservative. You want to know the answer? Pretty amazing. Direct quote here from the book. The results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were more accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. And I might just point out that that study was done about 10 years ago. You can imagine now with these kind of echo chambers, these liberal echo chambers, even sometimes a conservative echo chamber, as well as the conversation we had with Jonathan Haidt about his coddling of the American mind, that it's a good example that, yes, there's a division, but the biggest part of the division is conservatives oftentimes get at least what liberals are saying, even though they disagree with them. But liberals attribute almost anything that a conservative says to animus, hate, racism, homophobia, or Islamophobia. So that's the divided America we are dealing with. When we come back, we're going to spend some time looking at some of these very important issues in the news at our weekend edition. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Make your next bold move now. Give online at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. It's our future. The time is now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. We have a lot to cover today, but as we've been talking about most of this week, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about health care, and there are a couple of very good reasons for that. First of all, you have the lawsuit that was brought by the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Ken Paxton, along with a number of other attorney generals from some of the red states, really challenging the Affordable Care Act, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And then, of course, it's going to be defended by some of the attorney generals from some of the blue states, including California. So we'll talk about that. And of course, then the decision by the Justice Department to weigh in. And that brings us to two of the articles we've posted. One, which I've entitled Obamacare and Ken Paxton. That's the commentary that he wrote in USA Today. Second one by Dr. Romero Matthews. The Justice Department tries to correct Chief Justice Roberts' travesty. And then, just to be fair, also gave you one from the Wall Street Journal that tends to be critical. So that will be certainly a lot of what we'll talk about this hour. But then we also have a piece by Dr. Romero Matthews, What Medicare for All Supporters Won't Tell You. My commentary on Wednesday focused on that, and he will certainly educate us on this. And then a little bit later, we'll get into some of the other topics. We've talked about the Chick-fil-A story, Southern Poverty Law Center. And by the way, there's a campaign going on, so I've got a piece here about Joe Biden. So as always, Penna, we have lots to cover.
It's a busy show, and you know, it's I don't know, a little bit refreshing to turn from the Mueller report and the Barr summary of it. And so the question, I guess, another question we could ask is Nancy Pelosi now pivoting to health care?
Yes.
We are today.
We are. And again, we did talk earlier about this this week about this whole issue of the Mueller report and some of that, and Attorney General Barr, and we may get into that. But Dr. Romero Matthews, we've been waiting for you for no other reason than a lot of people have some questions because they've heard, I'll see if I can try to put that on the table correctly, that because the Republican Congress removed the individual mandate, which is essential to the Affordable Care Act, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, and others argue that since that's not there, and I won't use a lot of technical terms, but since there's no severability piece here, when you take one piece out, the whole thing collapses. And so they've been moving through the courts with this particular argument, and now that was sort of on the periphery until the Justice Department said, we're going to weigh in. And that brings us to some of the things you've been writing about.
Right. So a quick correction for what you said.
I need all that.
The tax legislation did not actually remove the individual mandate.
Remove the penalty.
Right. It didn't. The penalty is still there. They just made it zero. They couldn't remove it because they were going through the reconciliation process, so you can't actually affect non-tax related things in that. So what they said was we're just going to make the penalty zero. That's important because the net effect is there's no real mandate anymore for people to have health insurance. But a court might find that, or an appeals court is moving to the Fifth Circuit, the court might find that the tax penalty is still there. It's just zero. And so they didn't actually remove it. That it might hang on something that narrow.
I never even thought about that one.
So
there's a penalty, but it's a zero penalty.
It's a zero penalty.
Oh boy!
But there's still a penalty,
okay.
And so and so we don't know where the court's going to go with this. So the issue was that in June 2012, when the Supreme Court decided that Obamacare was in fact legal or constitutional. What they were looking at was the individual mandate. People said the liberals said this is justifiable under what's called the Commerce Clause because this has to deal with commerce over interstate. The four conservatives said it is not part of the Commerce Clause. That doesn't affect it here, and it's not constitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts initially was with the five. A new story came out. In fact, a new book is out at this, sort of looking at this. Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the five initially. But over the next 3 or 4 months, he had Satan was working or something. I don't know.
And whispering in his ear.
Whispering in his ear.
That's good.
And somehow or the other, he began to say, I'm going to try to find some way to do this, which goes against the whole idea of we interpret the law, we don't make law, and so forth. He was looking for a way to sort of bypass the law and make the mandate constitutional. He went and talked to the liberals about it. He said, well, it is a tax. You can make the case it's a tax, the penalty on it, and because it's a tax, Congress has the authority to tax. So I'm going to go along with the notion that the mandate is constitutional based upon the tax. Will any of you liberals agree with me? They all said no, but we'll side with you on the notion of affirming the mandate.
What a mess. That was a real mess.
It was a real mess. And so because Congress, as we discussed earlier, the tax reform bill zeroed out the penalty. So now and because Chief Justice John Roberts had said the penalty and the mandate and the law, they're all sort of intertwined. They sort of hang on each other. So you have to have that. The Obama administration said the same thing. And so now if there's no effective penalty, is the law still constitutional? And so Judge Reed O'Connor from Fort Worth, federal judge, in December said, well, apparently it's not. And he went a little bit further than what anybody thought he would do and say, I'm just going to invalidate the whole law. Now it goes to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans to figure out if that's okay. And the Trump administration, the Justice Department, weighed in saying we agree with the states. And I've been surprised, Kirby, at all this pushback from the various groups because the Justice Department weighs in on law, saying we agree with this, we disagree with that, and they see this as some kind of major step from the Justice Department when it's simply saying we agree with the states. So the Trump administration and the Justice Department has got a lot of pushback, not only from Democrats, but from Republicans for this because they still don't have a plan. And that's where we are right now.
Well, first of all, I guess I should ask you, buddy, and that is the Wall Street Journal has talked about this idea of severability. Mm-hmm. That and they seem to be saying because they don't agree with striking down Obamacare,
right?
Apparently,
the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing. So is that individual mandate part that turned out to be defined as a tax by Justice Roberts, is that severable from the rest of Obamacare or not?
That's the question. Typically, legislation includes a severability clause in there, which says if something found is unconstitutional or inappropriate, it doesn't eliminate the whole law. That I don't believe was in the legislation, and so as a result, that raised the question: if they don't have a severability clause, can you still make a severability finding in that? And
yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. My own thinking is the Medicaid provision in there is not dependent upon the mandate itself. You can expand Medicaid without the mandate and the other things in there. So if court came up and said, well, we find that you can still increase the mandate on Medicaid and you can expand that, I think that's probably a reasonable finding, but that's not what Judge O'Connor did.
One of the reasons we're talking about this, as Penna already alluded to, this may be a campaign issue where you're going to hear of people saying that if the Justice Department gets their way, if Donald Trump gets their way, none of you that have the Affordable Care Act will have it because it will be completely repealed and the Republicans have nothing to replace it with. So we'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The democratically controlled House of Representatives just passed a signature piece of legislation. The bill clearly illustrates what the congressional leaders would like to do in America if they could control both the houses of Congress and the presidency. The editors of National Review call it a legislative buffet of bad ideas. The Institute for Free Speech calls it the For the Politicians Act. And the American Civil Liberties Union wrote a letter to the members of Congress urging them to vote no on the bill. When you have such diverse groups expressing their concern about the bill, you know it has many problems. For example, the bill would expand the requirements for financial disclosure. First, this is of concern as a time when citizens are being harassed and intimidated because they supported a marriage amendment on the ballot. Second, even the ACLU has expressed concern that a person could be exposed as a political donor if an organization chooses, without the donor's knowledge, to mention a politician by name. The bill would also revamp the Federal Elections Commission and virtually assure that it would come under partisan control. The bill strips from the states the ability to draw their own congressional districts, which are much more likely to understand the cultures and different priorities of the regions in their state. Critics also see much of the bill is designed to limit political speech. We have seen the desire of social media outlets and universities to control any speech that is unpopular or contradictory to political correctness. The bill attempts to micromanage speech into government-approved lanes. It is unlikely that a Republican-controlled Senate will approve this legislation, but the bill does show what Democrat leaders would want to implement if Democrats win control of Congress and the White House. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us today. One of our articles that we've posted here is a piece that Ken Paxton wrote, and of course he is kind of the lead on that, one of 20 different Republican state attorneys that has been raising this issue and pursuing it through the courts, now going to the Fifth Circuit Court. And I mentioned just in passing, Penna, that there are those from the blue states, including the Attorney General from the state of California, that find themselves in a position where maybe they have to defend Obamacare, because once the Justice Department kind of weighs in, we got attorney generals against attorney generals. But the bigger issue is a lot of our listeners are saying, if they repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, what happens to me?
Well, it is a big issue in people's minds. And there was a CNN poll that came out this month. Voters listed the economy, immigration, and health care as their top issues. So it's no wonder that Nancy Pelosi is now pivoting from the Mueller report. But, just looking at this, there's sort of Republicans are divided on this, because some like the idea of repealing Obamacare. Others say, no, we should just fix it. Trump has already done some things where he's opened it up a little bit and allowed some different types of temporary short-term policies.
He just got a ruling against that, too.
Oh, he did. Okay, well, and then also the idea of banding together over industry groups.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those things, some Republicans are saying, well, let's just go further on that. And the Wall Street Journal points out that so many people now are relying on Obamacare as it is, that it's politically risky now for the White House and Republicans to have this, have it struck down at this time when, you're facing a presidential election. But Ken Paxton says, no, we have to maintain our fidelity to the Constitution. So we need to strike it down now that the individual mandate is gone. So now I guess the idea is, what are Republicans going to do? Because I don't have much confidence even at this point that there's an alternative out there. I mean, there needs to be a really good plan laid out. I read about one today called Choices that the Heritage Foundation wrote about, but it seems like it's very rudimentary. You will probably know more than I, Buddy, about what kinds of proposals there are out there to replace it. Republicans had a chance to repeal and replace, and I think a lot of people in the House and Senate were a little worried that there wasn't a replacement, and they didn't want to repeal without replace. So is that situation, will that be a different situation this time, or is it kind of the same case?
They still don't have a replacement plan. 9 years after the law passed, almost to the day, they still don't have a replacement plan.
And there are lots of good ideas.
There were replacement plans. There were some people, Tom Price was one, Congressman Tom Price. Paul Ryan wrote a sort of an outline of a plan as Speaker of the House. That was, all of those were fine, but they never came up with a replacement plan that said this is what we all agree on. And so the thing fell apart. And we've talked about this a while back, but the Republican plan had been, when Donald Trump came in office, they were going to repeal the legislation, Obamacare. Then once they had it off the books, they were then going to spend the next 2 or 3 months to develop a replacement plan. They were going to repeal it, but not eliminate it immediately. It was going to give it a 2-year phase out or so.
Right. They
would spend 2 or 3 months to come up with a new plan. They thought some Democrats might help them once Obamacare was officially repealed. So Senator Rand Paul, January 2nd, came out in a piece called Rare, in a publication called Rare, saying, we really shouldn't do repeal and then replace. We should do repeal and replace together. January 6th of 2017, Rand Paul did a tweet saying, I just talked to Donald Trump. This is before he's president, before inauguration, and he agrees with me. We need to do repeal and replace together. So that became the new strategy. The problem was there was no replacement plan. And so if you have to do it together, they sort of went on a burn the midnight oil thing for the next 6 to 8 weeks to try to come up with a replacement plan. They couldn't do it. In that 6 to 8 weeks, Democrats and the media started saying, well, wait a minute, if you're going to repeal this, what's going to happen to these people over here who have coverage? You're going to lose. They go out and interview people who say, well, if I lose my coverage, what in the world am I going to do? And as a result, they lost the momentum that they had going in at the beginning of January 2017. And we know the story now. They could never come back and do it. So the idea had been repeal it and then do a replacement plan. Once it became repeal and replace under Rand Paul, the whole thing fell apart.
I don't know if anybody else is noticing this, but I am noticing difficulty in getting doctor's appointments for different people that I know. More than existed. I mean, in the community of Dallas, Fort Worth, there are so many hospitals and doctors and medical facilities. It's very surprising to me that it's difficult to get into a doctor. And so I blame Obamacare when I think about it. I don't know if I'm rightly blaming Obamacare, but it feels to me like the system has been, not only is it now very expensive for most people, and coverage can be expensive unless you are under the subsidized category. But I'm just wondering if doctors are, as we warned, pulling out of the system. I do notice that when I go to doctors, I see PAs a lot more than I see doctors. Sometimes the doctor isn't even there.
Yeah.
So I think the system, yes, Americans worry that they will not have coverage, but I'm just wondering if you really went out there and did an extensive poll, and even of people who are under subsidized policies, how happy are people with health care right now compared to 5-10 years ago?
They're not terribly happy. They weren't terribly happy then, but now they're paying a lot more for something they're even less happy with. But your point is well taken, and both part of that is conscious and part of it is unconscious, or part of the side. For instance, MD Anderson, one of the major cancer centers in the world, will not take an Obamacare policy. They'll take Medicaid. They'll take Medicare, but they will not take Obamacare coverage. I think some of the doctors' offices, they don't sort of make a statement in most cases, but just limit their patient load of the number of people who are on Obamacare policies and those who are sometimes even Medicare or Medicaid. And there's not that many people on Obamacare policies.
No, there aren't. But I think it affects people well beyond people are on Obamacare policies when the system starts to degrade.
Obamacare had a role in the employer-based health insurance. That's half of the country gets it through the employer. But it really was fairly focused on the people who were getting health insurance through the exchanges. That was about 17 million people bought their own policies before Obamacare. The number of people who have their own coverage now under Obamacare is about 17 million people.
About the same.
It's just not the same people. Some of them are sicker. Some of them have lower income, and they're getting subsidies and things of that nature. So it hasn't actually changed. And that's why shortly before the presidential election, Barack Obama was out there saying, look, 85% of the country is not even affected by Obamacare. That was an overstatement, as he made often on things. Employers were affected by this. Medicare was affected, but not nearly as much as the individual market. But he's right. About 85% of the country is largely excluded from the Obamacare elements. They're excluded from the pre-existing condition. Listen to us, people.
Yeah.
The vast majority of you would not be affected by the pre-existing condition issue. It's those in the individual market who buy their own coverage. If you're not there, you really don't have anything to worry about on this.
And that was a question I was going to ask you before we take the break, because if there's one thing I hear all the time from politicians, campaign pundits, as well as supposed experts on television, all these people with pre-existing conditions. Can you straighten that out for a minute?
And not just supposed experts. The Department of Health and Human Services under Obama released a thing in 2012, 14, something like that, saying there was 129 million Americans potentially had pre-existing conditions and wouldn't be able to get health insurance. Wait a minute. You only had 30 or 40 million uninsured. So how is it that 129 million can't get health insurance because of a pre-existing condition when that was 3 times the number of people who were uninsured? And the uninsured, a lot of those were healthy people.
Yeah. So if a person says, I'm on Medicare, but I've got pre-existing conditions, will they still get Medicare?
Absolutely.
And if they're on Medicaid?
You could be on your deathbed and turn 65, and you will get Medicare. It doesn't affect Medicare. It doesn't affect Medicaid. It has very little impact upon the half the country that has employer-based health insurance.
So again, when you're watching television, you're reading the newspaper, most importantly, when you're hearing these politicians and you hear all this fear about pre-existing conditions, there are some. We'll come back, maybe give you the exact numbers, but there is just a lot of misinformation, right?
Well, there is, and I think this is one of the areas that the fear of God is in all the planners now. They're going to figure out a way to handle pre-existing conditions.
Yeah. I would think so. And again, that's almost become a mantra lately. Just it's just said
Absolutely
time
does.
and time
again. It's a hot
again.
button phrase.
It's a talking point, and it's just not true. And if it were true, we'd tell you. But the point is, it's just not. And again, we have all sorts of situations that we want to address. So let's open up the phones, because we're going to get to this idea of Medicare for all. But let's stay on this one for another few minutes. But if you got questions about health care or what the future holds for you and your family, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year. A month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. And by the way, if you find yourself saying, I want to read a little bit more about this, top 3 articles here all are about this issue of the Affordable Care Act and the particular lawsuit being brought forward by the Attorney General Ken Paxton of Texas, as well as 19 other attorney generals. And, of course, the Justice Department's decision to weigh in, and a very good piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews. The Justice Department tries to correct Chief Justice Roberts' travesty. And then a little bit later, we, of course, have one of his pieces on Medicare for All, and we have a lot more to cover, but we wanted to spend some time on this because many of you have had some questions. So let's go first to the state of Indiana. Larry, thank you for joining us today. What's your point of view?
Thanks for taking my call. One statement and a question. I believe, if you remember years ago, then I believe it was either Senator or Representative Obama, State Representative Obama had said that it would take approximately 10 years to get single payer in universally, throughout the United States. And now we're approaching, over 9 years now, pretty soon. And the longer it stayed in effect, the harder it's going to be to replace it. Expanding Medicare is just going to be another step closer to what it really is, that is socialized medicine. We keep calling it Medicare for All and things like that. My question is this: do any of you agree that since the Republicans didn't have a plan to replace it, even when they had that vote to repeal it, and they still don't have a plan, that they really don't want it repealed?
I don't know that I would say they don't want it repealed, but I would say they don't want to go through the fight to have it repealed. Yeah. They took a whipping on that in 2017, and they're afraid of taking a whipping again.
Yeah, if they could wave a wand,
if they could, right?
But they don't want to go through that battle,
and they don't want to go
during
through
an
that
election
battle.
year either,
right? And they know it's going to upset some people. Now, millions of Americans had their policies canceled under Obamacare. That didn't seem to bother the president too much, but a lot of them are afraid that they will have policies canceled and they'll have to take the political heat for that. So I think they would like to be able, if there were a plan that they could sort of agree on, and as Kerby said, they could wave a wand and it's done. I think they'd be glad to do that, but they don't want to have this battle again, which is why the president got a lot of pushback just for the Justice Department weighing in on a challenge out there that you'd expect the Justice Department to weigh in on.
So the Congress, it was a political battle between repealing and replacing or leaving it. But now it's a court battle.
Yes.
And so you wonder if that's going to affect public opinion, or if people are still going to blame the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress if Obamacare goes away and they lose something.
Republicans are in a bad spot.
They are.
Not one Republican voted for the legislation, but they're getting blamed for all the problems in Obamacare now, even though none of them voted and warned against it. But they would also get blamed if it goes away. So I think if it were me, I'd take the blame for if it goes away. But that's not a political calculation that a lot of them seem to be wanting to take.
I read yesterday that Mark Meadows, who's head of the Freedom Caucus, he began to, well, he's probably been looking at this for a while, but he was commenting on it and saying that seriously the Republicans do need to come up with a plan, and one where it's a lot more consumer friendly. There are a lot more free choices within health care. And I really believe if we put our minds to it, I believe conservatives, those Freedom Caucus guys, have an opportunity right now to put something together that's a comprehensive plan in one sense, so that everybody feels like, well, they're really going to have health care.
Well, here's the problem they face. The pre-existing condition issue that we've been discussing. Republicans were willing to sort of repeal Obamacare initially. So many of them now have bought on to this and are so afraid of the issue of being hammered by Democrats and the media about the pre-existing condition that they don't want to change that. If you don't change it, almost everything else just sort of follows from what you have in Obamacare. If you're going to say insurance company has to accept everybody, but wait a minute, you mean to tell me that if you got rid of, say, the provision in there that says the insurance company can't charge you more for a medical condition, So a patient comes up and says, okay, I've got cancer. I want to apply for insurance. The insurance company has to accept me, but the insurance company says it's going to charge me $100,000 a year. No politician wants to live with that. So they're going to keep the provision in there that says the insurance company can't charge you more for that pre-existing condition that you already have. When you put those two things together, almost everything else of Obamacare follows. When you start with that leg, when you take that first step, the rest of it follows. So you got to get rid of that. And yet Republicans are reluctant to get rid of it. As we saw in this last election, they were hammered on this issue of pre-existing conditions, even though it affects a relatively small portion. It does affect some people. There are people who were not able to get health insurance because of a pre-existing condition. We always sort of put that at about 1% of the population, maybe 3 million people or something like that. But you could create a safety net. You could create a good, viable option for them. But Republicans feel now that if they remove that pre-existing condition, they're going to be hammered so hard that they'll lose the fight.
And they were hammered even when there weren't a problem about pre-existing conditions.
That's right.
You know, I saw that in Robert Francis O'Rourke running against Ted Cruz. I mean, that was showing up time and time again. Mm-hmm. Before I take another phone call, Penna, you raised something interesting about these networks and everything. You know, you started noticing that even people that aren't in any way at all associated with the exchanges of the Affordable Care Act are starting to notice some things, aren't they?
Yeah, the old Obamacare promises about if you like your insurance company, you know, fine, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. They've both been proven wrong. And that's not just for people that are in Obamacare, it's for everyone, because you see the networks shrinking down, fewer doctors in certain networks. And so it's not true that if you like your doctor, you can keep him. I know so many people who are not in Obamacare, but they cannot now be insured to be able to go to the doctors that they've had. Same with insurance companies. It's really changed the equation. I mean, that was apparent right off the bat, because people who were out in the individual market started getting notices that their insurance companies were dropping them, and they had to go out and find something.
Yes, and Barack Obama won PolitiFact's Lie of the Year for 2013 for that. If you like your health plan, you can keep it. Well deserved.
Yes, and we will get to this idea of Medicare for all, but I love one of your lines here. If you like your employer-provided health coverage, you can't keep it. So
that's right. All the Medicare plans that we're talking about will eliminate employer-based health insurance out there. So for you, half of America, 49%, who get health insurance through through your employer. That's of the people who are covered. 49% of them, 49% of the country has health insurance through an employer. You will lose that. So if you really like that plan, and employers, I think Employee Benefits Research Institute, EBRI, has something like 81% or so like their employer-based health insurance plan, that goes away.
Yes. Well, and again, we'll get into rationing, too, because the bill creates, at least one of the bills, a physician practice review board that will assure quality, cost-effectiveness, and fair reimbursements. And you and I know what cost-effectiveness is. That's a code word for rationing, right?
It is indeed.
Let's take one more phone call, and then we will get into the alleged solution, the supposed solution, and that is Medicare for all and all the problems with it. But let's stay with some phone calls here. Ohio, WGGN. Kathy, thank you for joining us today.
Hi. I wanted to actually comment on the pre-existing. My husband has end-stage renal. And that, unfortunately, is one of the questions that if you want to apply for insurance, it asks specifically, have you ever been diagnosed with end-stage renal disease, been on dialysis or anything, but told that there's a chance that you would actually end up on dialysis? There is an actual question where that disqualifies you from any other assistance other than Medicare, unless you have employer insurance. And he had employer insurance, and we ended up having to go now to a supplement, and it's almost impossible to find somebody that would actually cover my husband under insurance because he's forced into Medicare once he goes on dialysis. End-stage renal disease is one of those pre-existing conditions that it's very difficult to find insurance for.
And that's correct. Medicare covers that. So Medicare typically covers seniors, but I don't remember the year, in the 80s or something, the federal government decided to put end-stage renal disease in there as a way to capture people who are need that care, because insurance companies, that's a known expense. It's a huge expense. And so you can't have an insurance company come up and somebody says, I'm going to apply for this, but I've got this huge expense. It's like what we were just talking about. The insurance company, if they're going to charge you an actuarially fair premium for somebody who's applying with end-stage renal, it would be thousands and thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So they created the Medicare, put the end-stage renal disease in there as a safety net for people. So you're not going to be able, in most cases, to get insurance to cover it.
Wow. We'll take a break. And then, of course, one of the things being proposed is this idea of Medicare for all. What Medicare for All supporters won't tell you. Well, Dr. Merrill Matthews will tell you right after this.
Have you heard about the Drag Queen Story Hours taking place at various public libraries across the country? These events started popping up a couple of years ago. They feature flamboyant drag queens reading stories to children, mostly in libraries, sometimes in schools or bookstores. One Detroit drag queen who read to kids at Huntington Woods Library marvels that the little girls thought she was a princess. The Washington Post reports that Drag Queen Story Hour aims to teach children gender diversity and acceptance. It was created in 2015 by a San Francisco writer, a new mother who wanted to provide young children with both a charismatic performance and cultural lesson. The events are popular at certain libraries. One parent says she's pleased that Drag Queen Story Hours expose kids to all kinds of different beautiful people in the world. The Post quotes another satisfied parent who says, "This is very different ideology from what the president is putting out there." The Drag Queen Story Hour, and yes, there is an actual organization, DQSH, has the full support of the American Library Association, which says the events create, quote, a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. The events have also drawn significant controversy, with parents complaining and protesters showing up outside libraries. Houston residents have filed a lawsuit to stop these taxpayer-funded drag events at Montrose Library. One popular drag queen reader there, Tatiana Malanina, translated Tatiana Bad Girl, is Alberto Garza. He was convicted in 2008 of assaulting an 8-year-old boy. Library officials admit, "We discovered we failed to complete a background check as required by our own guidelines." Cultural commentator Rod Dreher blogged last year about drag being politicized and valorized as a force for political progress, adding that drag queens and their supporters are grooming these kids to accept gender fluidity as normal. Forget Tatiana Bad Girl. Parents and officials who support this story hour agenda are abusing children. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Been focusing a lot of time and attention today on our weekend edition on healthcare, in large part because we have Penna Dexter here, as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews. One of the articles we just mentioned by him was on Obamacare and the Justice Department, but Penna, this 2-page summary is very good. What Medicare for All supporters won't tell you. Dr. Merrill Matthews helps us kind of wade through all the various pieces of legislation and share with us some of the real concerns.
Well, first of all, somebody said earlier in the program today that, it was one of our callers, Larry from Indiana, that back when we had the passage of Obamacare, and it was only Democrats. And a lot of folks really saw Obamacare as a step towards single-payer health care. And it's taken all these years, and now we're there, in a sense. Medicare for All is that. And so Dr. Matthews has written this. It's so good. It's so helpful. And I think the first sort of myth that people need to be disabused of is that, this is just expanding Medicare. Well, first of all, Medicare is something that people like for the most part.
Yep. 85% of seniors say they like their Medicare.
So if you're going to expand Medicare, you're going to ruin it. But this really isn't that.
No.
It's something totally different. They've just named it Medicare for All.
It's a marketing ploy to try to gain favor because Democrats are very good at marketing. And so they call it Medicare for All, and that means, you mean I can get what mom and dad had when they were seniors and stuff? Well, that's great. I mean, they didn't seem to pay much out for it and so forth because they paid for it through most of their working life, and then the taxpayers cover the rest of it. But yes, it's misnamed because they do actually do away with Medicare. If you have Medicare now and you like it, you will not have it under Medicare for All. You will have a government-run health plan that is different than traditional Medicare.
And you also won't have employer health insurance.
You also will not have employer health insurance because employers could conceivably offer some kind of supplement that covers what Medicare doesn't, or what the Medicare for All doesn't cover. But I wouldn't expect that to happen because under the full Bernie Sanders plan, you don't have any out-of-pocket cost. Under the new House plan that they proposed, that I think have 117 Democrats, you don't have any out-of-pocket cost, period.
I heard a speaker last night from England, and she talked about how, the healthcare system is pretty bad, and if you are wealthy, you still support it because there's another tier of health insurance that you can get if you can afford it.
I mentioned that in there. In England, 10.5% of the population opts out of the National Health Service, their plan, even though they pay taxes. So it's sort of like in the U.S., you have a certain percentage of people who say, I pay taxes for public education, but I'm taking my kid out and we're homeschooling them and putting them in private school, but you have to pay for that out of your own pocket. So in England, a little over 10% of the population actually does that. However, there are those, and most of the Medicare for All proposals do this, they do not allow an opt-out. So everybody has to be in the system. And the reason they do that, and it's not unreasonable, is they feel like if higher income people and politicians and so forth are able to opt out, they will do that, and there's less pressure upon Congress to try to keep the thing fully funded. And that's not an unreasonable concern. So everybody's got to be in there. But I will add, that's true for Medicare in the U.S. right now. If you're on Medicare and Medicare pays for something, if you go to your doctor and your doctor says, look, Medicare only pays $400 for that and it costs me $800, so I can't do that, you cannot pay the difference out of pocket. It's called balance billing. It's against the law. If you say, well, doctor, I'll just pay for it out of pocket. If Medicare pays for it, the doctor cannot do it unless the doctor's willing to forego seeing any Medicare patients for 2 full years. And since almost all doctors see Medicare patients because of hospital privileges and other things, it is very, very rare to do that. So you're essentially in that system right now. If you go into Medicare, Medicare has to pay for it. You cannot pay the difference. You cannot pay out of pocket.
I mentioned that physician practice review board, and that, of course, leads to the possibility of rationing. But in your piece here, you talk about 2 different kinds of rationing. One where the example you use, if you're 65 years of age and you need a pacemaker, maybe you'll get it. 75 or 85, no chance. But that's only one kind of rationing. The other is the rationing that oftentimes takes place, let's look at Canada, where you're just in a waiting line.
Right.
But you just wait and eventually die.
The Fraser Institute...
You're rationed out.
Yeah.
The Fraser Institute in Vancouver publishes every year a list of waiting lines in Canada for various types of medical procedures, and sometimes the wait may be a year or so, mostly for elective surgery. But in other cases, it could be, in some cases, it's a few months. So you have waiting lines there simply because in Canada, this is one of the ways they save money. You'll hear everybody say, well, these other countries spend less money than we do. Yes, they do. In most of them, they have what's called a global budget. The government says this is how much money you have to spend. And as a result, that's all you can spend. And you have to try to make do with that amount of money. It's not because they're more efficient. It's not because they're more cost effective or anything of that nature. The government just gives you a certain amount of money, and that's what you have to spend. So that because there is never enough money to go around, the government has to weigh healthcare expenditures versus Social Security versus defense versus education. Never enough money to go around. So the way they do it is they just ration, and you have waiting lines and other things.
Yeah. One other one I thought I'd mention, of course, we're talking about how that would affect patients, rationing, but how would it affect doctors and others? Because as I understand it, at least some of the bills right now have what are called participation agreements.
Yes.
You've already mentioned just a minute ago the participation agreement under traditional Medicare. But this one also is just very restrictive and is, in a sense, technically, no, they're not government contractors. Mm-hmm. Realistically, they're very similar, right?
And Medicare has that participation agreement. Yeah. I would expect that the under Medicare for All, they were essentially going to require doctors to be in the system, because otherwise you'd find a law from a lot of doctors who would decide to opt out, especially if patients can opt out. So it's a system where they will essentially say, look, we paid for a good chunk of your medical care, medical training. I think it used to be like $400,000 of federal money went to pay for each doctor's medical training. We spent money on you. If you're going to practice medicine in our state, you have to take these patients.
Wow.
Dr. Matthews, when they are trying to sell this, they talk about the failing healthcare system that we have in this country right now. But they neglect to mention, those on the left, that failing system is actually Obamacare.
It's Obamacare.
Do we really want them to now give us a bigger, more expensive, more draconian system?
You can't make this stuff up. You listen to Democrats who are pushing Medicare for All, and they say healthcare is too expensive, patients can't afford the premiums and so forth. Well, yes, but that's because they're in your Obamacare system. And you were the ones who promised they would be able to see doctors and premiums would be affordable. And now you're saying that they can't. If Obamacare had worked the way they had promised, you would not need Medicare for All.
Yes. Well, we're going to take a break and continue this for a little bit longer, because we haven't talked about what about the pharmaceutical companies, and is abortion in here, and a few other issues. But then we'll move on to some other topics. And as we take a break, I suspect some of you might want to give us a call. Maybe you have some comments or questions about health care. We're focusing on this because I am convinced, as Penna mentioned already, this is going to be the big issue, or one of the big issues during the campaign. We're going to hear a lot more about Medicare for All. We've already heard a little bit about this lawsuit making its way through now the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So we thought you would want to get some facts and figures and some information. So that's what we're doing. And again, the first 4 articles are those that we've been quoting from. So if you say, wait a minute, I need to read it for myself, or I need to pass this on to my friend, neighbor, coworker, maybe my doctor, my physician's assistant, or somebody else that needs to know about some of this, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us during the break, a good time to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after these important messages.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, Penna Dexter, Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio, and we've been spending a fair amount of time today talking about health care because, as Penna pointed out in the first hour, this is going to be a campaign issue. Nancy Pelosi has made it clear. Of course, almost all of those individuals running on the Democratic side for the presidency, hoping to gain the nomination, supporters of Medicare for All. So we've posted some of those articles as well. And the first four articles deal with the lawsuit making its way through the court, also one by Dr. Merrill Matthews on Medicare for All. And, of course, some of you have some questions or some comments or some stories, so we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Louisiana, WPAE. Catherine, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Tell us your story. As I understand, your son has a much higher deductible. How much?
Yes. Well, $10,000.
$10,000. That's called sticker shock.
So you just write a check every time.
That's like no insurance.
It's like no insurance.
Wow.
And then his medicines, because they have them tiered, the medicines that work for him are so expensive, like $1,200, $1,500, $2,000 a month.
Yep.
He's had medications, and the ones that he's on are medications he tried before that did not work well. So not only is his health care exorbitantly expensive, he can't even get the medications that actually work for him.
Right. This is, Catherine, this is all done by insurers as ways to try to save money.
Yeah.
So as strange as it sounds, if they were to cover all those things at a reasonable rate, the insurance, the deductible and the would be even higher, and the premium would be even higher.
Even higher.
So what they've done, what insurers have done over the past decade, really, I mean, they've introduced tiers. There used to be 2 tiers. So you would go to the pharmacy and you would have, if you were getting a brand name drug, you had a 1 tier. Let's say $20 out of pocket or $25 copay. If you got a generic, it'd be $10. Then they introduced a 3rd tier, and then they introduced a 4th tier, and in some cases they even have a 5th tier.
Wow. And
on those 4th or 5th tiers, they may be charging you 25%, 30%, or 40% of the cost of the drug. So it's not a copay of $10, $25, in some cases $50 or $100. It's a percentage of the cost of the drug. And if the drug costs $70,000, $80,000 a year or $5,000 a month, and you've got to pay 25, 30, 40% of that, you could easily be out $1,000 or $2,000 a month just to help pay for that drug. And in some cases, cancer patients and others, they may have 2 or 3 drugs that are that expensive.
Okay, Medicare for All thinks it has a solution, and that is if, again, you are a pharmaceutical company, we will tell you what you should charge for those drugs, and if you won't, then we'll take your patent or transfer your patent. And I don't think anybody understands what that means, because let's at least for a minute have some sympathy for the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, they develop all sorts of different drugs, and then most of them don't work, and then they go through clinical trials, and even fewer of them do, and then some have contraindications, and eventually the FDA allows them to get one to put out on the market. Mm-hmm. Then they get a patent for it, and they're trying to recoup enormous amounts of costs back there. But then the federal government says, you know what, we're going to just tell you that you can only charge $5.
I've gone through this and done the math on it. It cost a drug company directly out of pocket, on average, about $1.7 billion to produce a new drug.
Wow.
On average, for a newly approved drug. That's not what they're saying. I took the number that they charge to research and development on their tax bills, and then divided that by the number of new drugs approved by the FDA, and then rounded out over 10 years, because the numbers that come out every year, I mean, maybe 20 approved this year, 40 approved the next year. So I rounded out over 10 years, $1.7 billion. So it is expensive to produce a new drug. That's for newly. Yes. But here's the other thing that's happening. In years past, drug companies produced drugs that were, think of Viagra and those have Lipitor and so forth. Millions of people use those drugs. So you can spread that $1.7 billion over a lot of people. They were criticized over the past decade for saying, well, you're only doing this stuff that, sort of lifestyle drugs and not really that helpful. You need to really go out and find these drugs that help. Last 10 years, they've been going to what's called biologics. These are injectable drugs mostly. Very hard to come up with, but they're addressing issues like Alzheimer's, asthma, a whole range of things, various types of cancer, hepatitis C. That we've got a cure for hepatitis C now.
It's just so expensive.
It is very expensive, but they have a cure for that now. There's actually 2 or 3 drugs out that deal with that. But these are for much smaller populations. So instead of spreading that $1.7 billion over 10 million people over every year, you're spreading it over 25 or 30,000 or 40,000 people every year. When you do the math, it's going to be a lot more expensive. Even if we could find a way to keep those prices down, you just have far fewer people who are benefiting from these drugs.
She was saying, of course, off air mostly, that this was due to the Affordable Care Act. And if I can quote Dr. Romero Matthews from a little less than 2 years ago, you were pointing out that you had a friend in Northern Virginia, and he was looking at his family health insurance options, Care First, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Gold Lever, HMO. And he was recognizing, as you began to realize, that, wait a minute, I could lease a high-end car, a Bentley, $2,200, an Aston Martin, $2,300 a month, Rolls-Royce, $2,700 a month, and he's instead paying $3,000 a month. So for less than he was paying for an HMO, which isn't exactly the most premium policy yet, you could rent the ultra high-end car for less.
Yeah, it's amazing that health insurance, that's a family policy, but it's amazing that you can go out and rent a Bentley for less than you could get a family policy in health insurance.
This may be a question that bleeds over the break, but what about in some countries with drugs and treatments, they are required to take the least effective or the lowest level, least expensive treatment and try that on patients. Try and kind of step up to the most expensive treatment.
It's called step therapy or fail first.
Right, fail first. So you've got a doctor who's a really great doctor. He knows what's going to work on his patient. He knows the patient, he knows the drug, but he cannot immediately give that right away. He's got to go through these steps first. The patient could get sicker or die, but that doesn't matter,
That's right. It's a money-saving technique. That they do. So they'll say, here's a less expensive drug that's been out for a while. Maybe there's a generic version. You have to try that. If that fails, then we'll move you to a more expensive drug or to the newer drug. And so you go through this step therapy, or as I said, fail first, which doesn't sound that good of a health care deal when it's fail first.
Would we have that under Medicare for All?
It has already been proposed by the Trump Health and Human Services for Medicare now.
Oh.
For what's called Part B in Medicare, where doctors prescribe. Doctors sometimes deliver cancer drugs and so forth in clinic or something that's covered under Part B of Medicare. The concern is they think it's getting too expensive. So it has actually, Alex Azar, the head of Department of Health and Human Services, has proposed that for Medicare Part B right now.
Yeah, well, there you go. So you can see that it would end up in Medicare for All if indeed that is passed. And so anyway, we've just been trying to cover some of these healthcare issues. Maybe we'll get into a couple other topics because, of course, we have a campaign going on right now. And so maybe we'll broaden it a little bit more. But still, if you have some questions about some of the healthcare issues, it is going to be front and center in this campaign. That's why we wanted to cover some of this. Those first 4 articles all address that issue. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The democratically controlled House of Representatives just passed a signature piece of legislation. The bill clearly illustrates what the congressional leaders would like to do in America if they could control both the houses of Congress and the presidency. The editors of National Review call it a legislative buffet of bad ideas. The Institute for Free Speech calls it the For the Politicians Act. And the American Civil Liberties Union wrote a letter to the members of Congress urging them to vote no on the bill. When you have such diverse groups expressing their concern about the bill, you know it has many problems. For example, the bill would expand the requirements for financial disclosure. First, this is of concern as a time when citizens are being harassed and intimidated because they supported a marriage amendment on the ballot. Second, even the ACLU has expressed concern that a person could be exposed as a political donor if an organization chooses, without the donor's knowledge, to mention a politician by name. The bill would also revamp the Federal Elections Commission and virtually assure that it would come under partisan control. The bill strips from the states the ability to draw their own congressional districts, which are much more likely to understand the cultures and different priorities of the regions in their state. Critics also see much of the bill is designed to limit political speech. We have seen the desire of social media outlets and universities to control any speech that is unpopular or contradictory to political correctness. The bill attempts to micromanage speech into government-approved lanes. It is unlikely that a Republican-controlled Senate will approve this legislation, but the bill does show what Democrat leaders would want to implement if Democrats win control of Congress and the White House. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue taking some of your calls if you'd like, but I did want to at least focus on the campaign, because back in February, I wrote a piece in which I said this may be the first time we have what might be called a woke primary. By woke, you mean anybody that's alert to or sensitive to injustice, and you've had the hashtag Me Too movement, and you've had the governor getting in trouble in Virginia for someone in blackface. You've had people alleging that they are kind of creepy candidates. I'm kind of leading up to someone in just a minute here. But even last week, when we spent some time talking about the so-called woke primary, we were talking about Robert Francis O'Rourke, or Beto O'Rourke, people accusing him of, maybe white privilege. Elizabeth Warren had to apologize for pretending to be a Native American. Kristen Gillibrand apologizing because she one time used the term illegal alien. But this has not been a good week, Penna, would you say, for Joe Biden? And so that's our fifth article on there. What's your thoughts about what has transpired even this week? Because my argument is that this may not be the year for Democrats having a white male on the ticket. What's your thoughts?
It might not be. And, of course, this is the first presidential race under the hashtag Me Too movement. And then you have Joe Biden there, who presided over the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, where Anita Hill had to come before the committee, which was all composed of men, I think all white men, but all men for sure. Yeah. And Joe Biden, he was confirmed, and her concerns were, some people said, not taken seriously. And now he's
On an apology tour.
He is on an apology tour,
Yeah.
but the left doesn't think he's apologizing enough for this.
Mm-hmm.
He's not contrite enough. He hasn't gone directly to Anita Hill to apologize. She says she doesn't care about that. She's moved on. But so that's part of his terrible week. Other parts of his terrible week just have to do with the other parts of the woke agenda. And he sounds, really sad. And here's part of his strategy is to float Stacey Abrams, who lost. She lost the governor race in Georgia, and
still hasn't conceded.
She has not conceded. She's very popular in the Democrat left group. They love her, and so she was the person who gave the rebuttal to the State of the Union address, and so he's floating her as his running mate, thinking that will help him. It's crazy. It's really, Kerby, you love the phrase, you can't make this up. You really cannot make this up.
Well, let me just remind people that Joe Biden was running for president, I think, in 1987 for the 88 election, and had to suspend his campaign because he was found to have plagiarized Neil Kinnock, the socialist.
I remember that, but again, you have to be as old as we are to remember that. But go ahead. Yeah.
and so he plagiarized 6 pages of Neil Kinnock, the British socialist, which I find interesting. Nobody criticizes him for that now because the Democrats have all moved over to that side. So it's I'm just really looking forward to Joe if he gets in, because he is such a gaffe machine.
It'll be fun.
Yeah, Jay Leno just said, "I hope you run again." Back when Jay Leno was late night, but I'm sure everybody else as well, Jimmy Kimmel and all the rest, are looking forward to it because he just does seem to say something almost every week.
After Sarah Palin had her issues, Joe Biden was on with what was her name, from CNN, and now she went over to he was being interviewed and said, if I remember right, when the Depression hit, Franklin Roosevelt went on television. Franklin wasn't president for another 3 years, and television was only really sort of in a research phase at the time.
Well, one of his problems is going to be fundraising, probably, because O'Rourke and also Bernie Sanders both raised a lot of money right away in the first couple of days of after their announcements. They were small donors and just lots of them. And so, you just kind of wonder if a Biden would have that ability to do that, to raise that money very quickly. Now, there might be some of the, I don't know, perhaps, I guess I could say wiser minds in the party who want a more establishment, quote unquote, candidate that would get behind him. But those don't tend to be the kind that just come in very quickly right after an announcement. And that a lot of people use that as a barometer of whether this person is viable.
And just to get a sense of this, I was looking at last night on the news, and they ran the list of the top Democrats and their percentage and so forth, and Biden came in top, but it was only 19%.
Yes.
And Bernie Sanders was down, I think, around 11 or 12%.
That's just name identification.
And Robert
right now.
Francis over 8 or 9%. These are not large numbers.
No.
So you can still be sort of ahead there and still not have very much support in the Democratic Party because there's so many. In fact, the question now is not who's joining the Democratic presidential race, is who's staying out. I mean, that's maybe a smaller number.
There is something else about this particular election season, and I've said it before, and I will say it again, that by this time next year, it's already over because you have a Super Tuesday on March 3rd, which always has a lot of the states like Texas and many of the southern states, but now has California.
Right.
Penn and I both grew up in California, different parts of the state, but nevertheless, remember when you would vote in June and it meant nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, it means a lot now because March 3rd will be it. So it means somebody with a lot of money or somebody with a lot of name ID, and that, of course, is Joe Biden and a few others.
And Bernie Sanders.
Might have more of an advantage than some of those others.
And then Kamala Harris probably thinks she does, too, because she actually held statewide office in California. So, boy, it's going to be interesting and fun to watch. Joe Biden in many national polls beats Donald Trump right now. But I don't know how that will change, especially given realities of the economy and some of the cost figures that start to come out that are attached to some of these really far left proposals.
You know, and we should mention too, Joe Biden. I mentioned him running in the 1988 election, but he's run another time or two, and he had to drop out almost immediately just because in Iowa he was getting maybe 1%, 2% favorable rating. So we don't know where this is going to go, but it's not clear even if he gets in that he'll get much support once he starts doing it.
Well, again, this is something we've never really seen before with so much on a Super Tuesday, March 3rd, and then sort of a second Super Tuesday on March 10th. If it's not over by March 3rd, I'll guarantee it's probably over by March 10th. And it is amazing to see how it's going to play out. So if nothing else, there, again, just notice how, except for, of course, Penna mentioned Kamala Harris, but except for that, well, all the others we've been talking about are men. And if indeed you are convinced that this, in especially this hashtag Me Too world, a woman has a better chance, then again, maybe that tips it in a different direction, too.
But it's interesting because Elizabeth Warren has really been flat so far.
It hasn't worked for her
Kirsten
yet.
Gillibrand has not gotten. Amy Klobuchar has just not. They've not gotten much momentum yet.
Yes.
It may be the men who grovel the most. I see Beto O'Rourke as a groveler. I really do in his speeches, and this week was a groveling week for Joe Biden.
So we'll see. Well, nothing else. I just wanted to put that on the table. And if you find yourself saying, well, we'd like to read a little bit more about that, this piece from National Review, it's just not a good week. It was a terrible week for Joe Biden, and just gives you a little bit of an understanding of some of the things that are going to be part of the political reality. And if nothing else, maybe we'll get an idea, because the first debate is in June. And do you have to have a certain amount of ID or a certain amount of money raised to be qualified? So again, we might see, like we did with the Republicans, we have the adult table and the children's table. You think that's a possibility?
I don't think they're going to do that again. That got too much criticism.
That got too much criticism. So we'll see what it is. But again, trying to sort some of those out in terms of all the candidates, but then also sorting out all those issues. This week, we, of course, I'll get a real quick comment from you before we take a break. We had a vote, or sort of a non-vote, on the Green New Deal. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I thought it was pretty bold of Mitch McConnell to hold the vote on the Green New Deal. And of course, there was not one Democrat that voted for it. 43 voted present.
The profile in courage was only Mitch McConnell.
So I just thought I'd mention that, too, because that's one of about 15 issues that at least one or more of these people running for the Democratic nomination for president are talking about. But again, you've got to recognize that some of the party faithful are going to say, well, you talk about the Green New Deal, but when it came time to vote on it, you voted present. That didn't exactly cause us to be really involved in the conversation or even in your campaign. So we'll take a break and come back and maybe get into a couple of other issues. I'd like to go around the round table. Chick-fil-A was in the news earlier in the week, and we thought it was a one-day story, but it has become a lot more. And not only the San Antonio airport, but now even some of the questions being raised about whether or not federal grants should be given to San Antonio. So we'll talk about that right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to get into Chick-fil-A in just a minute, but we've got some calls left over on this issue of health care, and that's certainly front and center. So, Colin in Missouri, I think you want to talk about your experience on, was it Medicare?
Yes, I think we should all have it. And I'm retired, and I get good pension, and my health care is covered, but about a third of it goes to my insurance. And I'm diabetic, and that's a red flag for somebody to take me on. And they try to demonize socialism. Whoever gave us that and protect their Social Security would be sure to win. But, you know, it's a universal God, and math is a universal language. They use it in every country, and as we speak about the numbers, you can't expect somebody not to do the best they can for themselves. It has to add up. If it keeps going backwards, that's a formula for being depressed. American people know that they've got to work till they die the way things are, and it's depression to know that you got to work and pay all your health high rate while you're old. And my doctor, I know him. I met him at ringside and fighting. And these drug companies are paying them money, big money, to promote it, send them on vacations to push the drugs. He told me it personally. And the first
okay,
drug
well, let me just spend some time talking about that, because, you know, one of the most hated institutions in the country seems to be lately Big Pharma.
Yes.
And at the same time, you've got to recognize that they're not going to be innovating if they don't have some kind of possibility of being able to at least recoup their costs, right?
So, Colin, you are over 65 and on Medicare, is that right?
No, I'm not. I draw up through pension. I'm 60 and was allowed to retire at 58, and it comes through my union. I was a union worker.
I see. So you're when you said you were retired, I thought maybe you were already on Medicare. So you've got a little ways to go yet. You've got another 5 years. But he's retired and he has that union and the health insurance that sort of covers that. But people who turn 65 these days, typically, you can make the case that because of the medical problems that seniors have, that it would make a certain amount of sense to have a program that addresses that. Interestingly, though, now they used to say, well, we really can't figure out how to do anything with Medicare because it's a defined benefit plan. You turn 65, you have Medicare, you're able to go to the doctor's office and so forth. But in the 1990s, they passed what was called a Medicare Plus Choice. It's now called Medicare Advantage.
Right.
And about a third of seniors actually opt out of traditional Medicare, and the federal government just writes a private sector health plan, a check once a year, to cover all of the seniors' care. So, you can the private sector is now involved in Medicare, providing comprehensive care. And of course, the question is, if the government's just going to write a private sector health plan, a check once a year to cover my health when I'm retired, why can't I save my own money and write the check myself instead of giving it to the government? But Colin is raising a few points about it because we do still have challenges, and Medicare has challenges. He'll still have premium payments once he goes into Medicare.
Yeah, but again, his point is a lot of people like Medicare.
Yeah.
But if you call this, instead of Medicare for all, VA for all, which is probably a little closer, or National Health Service for all, which would be what is essentially what it's moving towards, what you have in England, that wouldn't be quite so popular.
Right.
It seems like a focus-driven kind of phrase, Medicare for all.
Colin was had union coverage, and that union health care is typically very, very good and comprehensive.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that looks good, and Medicare will probably be less so compared to what he has, and he may end up having to pay more out of pocket for Medicare now.
Well, again, if you'd like to go ahead.
Well,
Penna?
one of the points he brought up, too, was prescription drugs and the cost of them.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about the amount that it costs to innovate and to get these drugs to market, get them approved and all of that. If we end up with a system, a single-payer system, and part of that is substantially lowering drug costs, we will cease to be the country that provides the innovation in drugs. I mean, there's no way. You can't ask these companies to just spend billions of dollars and not have some way of recouping the cost. The way they do it now is charging a lot. I know that they are demonized in a sense, and there are probably some abuses and issues out there.
There are some abuses,
but America will not be the country that innovates if we go to the same kind of system that they have in these European countries.
And one of the problems we have in the healthcare system, and this is true in the whole healthcare system, is the lack of transparency. Because the drug companies innovate, you have the pharmacy benefit managers. There's 3, I think, major ones that come in. They negotiate major discounts from the drug companies, but they don't pass all those discounts on to individuals. Insurance companies get some of the discounts, and so individuals, the PBMs have done some things over the past that have created some problems, including discouraging pharmacies from saying, well, if you just pay for this out of pocket rather than using insurance, it'll actually cost you less out of pocket than using your insurance. Now, President Trump signed a law prohibiting that anymore, but it's part of our whole dysfunctional healthcare system. And Obamacare exacerbated the problem rather than helping.
Let me take one more call because everybody likes to beat up on Big Pharma, so I'll give you that opportunity. John in Texas, KBJS. I think you have some concerns about the pharmaceutical industry, so you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I certainly can.
All right. Yeah, as far as my point of view, the Lord Jesus Christ made everything we need to stay healthy. The pharmaceutical industry is a bunch of liars, thieves, and murderers. I read the book, The 1 Minute Cure, about using oxygen for health. And 150 years ago, people in India were using hydrogen peroxide to cure their illnesses. And the pharmaceutical industry that existed then went out and hired a journalist to impersonate a doctor and told everybody that oxygen didn't work, and everybody quit using it. And the pharmaceutical industry has been the same lie for at least 150 years. Well,
again, I've heard those kind of comments all the time. I'm sure you have as well.
And I won't be one to agree with him on that. He's talking about India. Actually, India has been going through their Vedas, some of their scriptures, because they did use a lot of natural cures there, and they're trying to find which those were, because some of the companies have actually been looking in China and India and some of the natural things that were used as cures in years past to see if they can find a molecule in there, what's working here, and let's see if we can separate that and use it for to be able to provide a drug. But millions of people are alive today because they are able to use certain types of drugs that they could not use or were not available in times past.
But again, it's probably helpful to look at healthy situations and other alternatives. Penna, you and I have talked about that before as well. So again, some of those solutions are in nature,
it's
aren't
more,
they?
I think that your healthy lifestyle that you begin as a habit while you're healthy will benefit your health throughout your whole life. And sometimes if you get sick, certainly you should research and try to find out how you can eat better, exercise. There's certain remedies you can get. I mean, you've got the health food industry out there. I love all of that. That has benefited my family and my own personal health. But that is not to discount the tremendous benefit that has come from medical science and the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, as Dr. Matthews mentioned, sometimes you need a drug. Sometimes you need a prescription, and you just need it.
Even if you were to say hepatitis C was, somebody got that by using a needle or something else that they shouldn't have been doing. Some people have gotten it accidentally, and you want to be able to have a cure for that person. So, yeah, there are some challenges there, but there are drugs out there that we turn to every day that we need to.
And back to the point that Penna made just a minute ago, if indeed all of a sudden some unelected bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. determines what you can or cannot charge for a particular drug, you can see exactly what's going to happen upstream, and that is they're going to say, well, then why do we keep doing any kind of investigation? Because back to your number of more than $1 billion per drug to get it to the market.
And I've had Tom Nelson on here talking about the depression that he faced at times. Yeah. He tried a couple of times after he was diagnosed with depression to try to get off the drug that he uses, and it goes downhill. So he says, I am now going to use this. My wife is there. We're making sure I take this every day.
Every day. We're going to come back, and we will spend just a little bit of time talking about Chick-fil-A. And I might just mention Penna Dexter's commentary today. is one that, if nothing else, just illustrates again why we do what we do here. It's called the Drag Queen Story Hour, and it's, if nothing else, just a reminder of some of the things happening in our local libraries. So we've got a lot more to cover. We'll do our best in trying to cover a few things right after these important messages.
Have you heard about the Drag Queen Story Hours taking place at various public libraries across the country? These events started popping up a couple of years ago. They feature flamboyant drag queens reading stories to children, mostly in libraries, sometimes in schools or bookstores. One Detroit drag queen who read to kids at Huntington Woods Library marvels that the little girls thought she was a princess. The Washington Post reports that Drag Queen Story Hour aims to teach children gender diversity and acceptance. It was created in 2015 by a San Francisco writer, a new mother who wanted to provide young children with both a charismatic performance and cultural lesson. The events are popular at certain libraries. One parent says she's pleased that Drag Queen Story Hours expose kids to all kinds of different, beautiful people in the world. The Post quotes another satisfied parent who says, "This is very different ideology from what the president is putting out there." The Drag Queen Story Hour, and yes, there is an actual organization, DQSH, has the full support of the American Library Association, which says the events create, quote, a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. The events have also drawn significant controversy, with parents complaining and protesters showing up outside libraries. Houston residents have filed a lawsuit to stop these taxpayer-funded drag events at Montrose Library. One popular drag queen reader there, Tatiana Malanina, translated Tatiana Bad Girl, is Alberto Garza. He was convicted in 2008 of assaulting an 8-year-old boy. Library officials admit, "We discovered we failed to complete a background check as required by our own guidelines." Cultural commentator Rod Dreher blogged last year about drag being politicized and valorized as a force for political progress, adding that drag queens and their supporters are grooming these kids to accept gender fluidity as normal. Forget Tatiana Bad Girl. Parents and officials who support this story hour agenda are abusing children. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let's, if we can, just real quickly go around the roundtable on Chick-fil-A. And 2 years ago, I pointed out, actually now I guess it's almost 4 years ago, I stand corrected, there was an attempt in the Denver airport by the city council to prevent Chick-fil-A from actually having a restaurant. If you've ever flown through the Denver airport, you know that Chick-fil-A has the longest line there, and that's because after they said, well, they're anti-LGBT, Denver lawyers sat down in a closed-door meeting and said, you know, if you're barring a business on the basis of political prejudice, that's going to result in a First Amendment lawsuit, and you will lose. So they backed down. But more recently, Penna, as you well know, the city council in San Antonio said, we're not going to allow Chick-fil-A to come in. And at first, I was just covering it kind of as a Texas story. But then our good friends at First Liberty, we've even can make available to people this very lengthy letter by Hiram Sasser, who's been on the program with us, to Elaine Chao, who, of course, is an individual that is head of the Secretary of Transportation, and others saying, well, if you're going to ban Chick-fil-A, you might be ineligible for federal grants. What about this?
Yeah, that's they aren't like taking a case or taking a legal action. They're just writing this letter, but it's a good little carrot, I think, to hang over them. There was this report that came out from Think Progress just recently, and I think that's why San Antonio made the decision. They were going to allow Chick-fil-A, and then they pulled that, detailing the 2017 charitable contributions to religious organizations from Chick-fil-A, which makes them a, I guess, hateful organization, discriminatory group. And it's just too bad. Chick-fil-A is so good, delicious, and popular among people. And I'm just glad to see that, this has actually sparked some publicity and controversy because, when the public starts weighing in, I think the airport may think twice.
What I thought was so interesting is in the Denver case, which I guess is now in 2015, so I realize it's actually been now almost 4 years ago, that was just because they saw Chick-fil-A as anti-LGBT, which is kind of funny because what they were doing is criticizing Dan Cathy, who is Truett Cathy's son, about something he said about supporting marriage, which at the time, by the way...
between one man and one woman.
Yeah. But the one in San Antonio, they had a threefer. They said, well, they're anti-LGBT, but they were also supporting, are you ready for this? The Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which is supposedly a hate group, and the Salvation Army, which is supposedly a hate group. And that one really caught me off guard. I mean, how in the world you can say that the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, because they support young people and encourage them, but at the same time also have a biblical view of sexuality, is enough to say this is why we're not going to let Chick-fil-A actually have a restaurant in the airport.
And just to be clear, unlike the Colorado Baker case, Chick-fil-A is not denying service to anybody. I mean, if you're LBGT and you want to go buy something, you can buy something there. You want to get a tray of sandwiches to take to a party or something, you can do that. So it's simply what some of the corporation and some of the people who are ahead of the corporation have decided to do.
And again, I might even point out, somebody was saying, yeah, but go try to work at Chick-fil-A and be homosexual. And I'm saying, as far as I know, they don't even prevent you from working there either. So it is just simply, we don't agree with some of the money that you have given to these offensive organizations, which are not offensive, but nevertheless, it's just an illustration of where it is actually beginning to unfold. And people before said, well, that's just those groups, they're real political. Well, Chick-fil-A is not political, and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes is definitely not
and
political.
Salvation Army
and
is.
Salvation Army is. So it shows you the extreme directions that some of these individuals are going. And again, the city council is free to make that decision. We're also free to decide whether or not federal grants should keep going with that, and they're free to decide what they want to do. But at the same time, I think they're making a really big mistake.
I think they are, and I think we ought to talk it up, ladies and gentlemen, because as you go with your friend through the drive-through for lunch at Chick-fil-A, just remember what's happening to that great organization. And a lot of times in these big cities that are going liberal. In Texas, we have a few of them. Their city councils get to do things like that because it's under the radar. So let's keep it out from under the radar.
So again, just thought I'd mention that. In the state of Texas, I know they have a Free to Believe Act that's being debated right now by Bill Zedler, HB 1035. And we might point out, Penna, for just a minute, since our First Liberty people aren't here, so we'll do the work for them since they're not here, that this is the same organization that is supporting and defending Aaron and Melissa Klein. And also those that have been very supportive with amicus briefs of things like Jack Phillips and others. And I see a real difference. Some people say, well, what's the difference? Well, a lot of difference, because Jack Phillips is free in his privately owned bakery to decide what kind of creativity he's going to have. But at the same time, if you come in and you want cookies or cakes or anything, he's glad to sell them to you and doesn't check out your sexual orientation. Chick-fil-A says that they make no distinction between who they serve based on gender, race, sexual orientation, anything like that. So certainly people are free to make that decision. But when you have a public facility, I think the airport fits into that category, and then says we're going to eliminate this particular group because we disagree with them politically, that's a little different situation, don't you think?
It is different. I'm glad to see this is being debated in the form of legislation. Not that we can legislate this particular issue, but the idea that people need to understand that they are free to operate their business according to their beliefs, but also to outside of their business, as in the case of Chick-fil-A, maybe some of the profits are given to charitable organizations. If they're religious, that does not disqualify them.
And while you wouldn't want to take it too far, if it becomes appropriate to eliminate an organization because of the money that organization gives to people, do individuals become next in some sense?
Yeah. And that's really one of the concerns of HB1, because or HR1, I should say, that actually passed the House and went to the Senate, because even the ACLU was saying this legislation passed by the Democratic and controlled Congress could put a donor at risk, because a donor will not necessarily be able to control what an organization might do, and they may just think they're producing or donating to an organization that's not political, and then it becomes political and it reveals those individuals. Guess what happens, especially if you supported like a marriage amendment or something like that? Remember how those people were harassed and boycotted, and some people even lost their jobs over that?
Brandon Ike out in California over Prop 8, he gave $1,000. He ended up out as head of a big tech company.
So again, just a little bit more of an understanding of some of those issues. I thought I'd just mention in passing that this is something that CNN covered, but we haven't really talked about. But it turns out that CNN uncovered, and I think this is really good, that the Department of Defense has authorized $1 billion by reassessing some of the budget. So that will go to build 57 miles of fencing through the Department of Defense. And that is in a letter they came across from the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen. Well, we'll give credit to CNN for mentioning it, but probably nobody else knows that $1 billion just went to build 57 miles of fencing 18 feet high. So I thought I'd just mention that before we run out of time today.
Yeah.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, thank you for helping us answer many of the questions about health care. If you find yourself saying, well, he didn't answer all my questions, IPI.org, right?
IPI.org, and everything's available there, free for you people to consume and share.
And again, FirstLiberty.org. Of course, Penna Dexter's commentary today that you can receive, and all sorts of great material on our website, pointofview.net. Next week is our Truth Team. Just going to be a great opportunity to hear from all sorts of experts. So I hope you have a great weekend. Look forward to joining with you again. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. Look forward to seeing you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.